Welcome to The Lead, the New Lines Magazine podcast. I'm Faisal Al Yafai, and this is a podcast where we delve into the biggest ideas, events, and personalities from around the world. The Gaza Strip measures 141 square miles, meaning the entire territory is less than a third of the size of the city of Los Angeles. And yet, Israel's war on Hamas currently raging inside Gaza has had a huge impact politically and economically in the region and around the world. There are even suggestions that Joe Biden's policy regarding the war could swing the hugely consequential November presidential election against him. Around the Middle East and the surrounding region, the conflict is no less potent of a political issue. While the general public across the region is generally sympathetic to the Palestinian cause, that is not universally the case for their leaders. The conflict has tested allegiances and exacerbated rivalries. At the same time, a much feared regional spillover of the war has not, yet, taken place. Joining me this week are three international correspondents who have lived and worked in some of the regional countries most affected by the ongoing conflict. Chloe Cornish is the Gulf business correspondent for the Financial Times, based in Dubai, before which she acted as the paper's Middle East correspondent from Beirut. Tara Kangarlou is an independent journalist who has reported extensively from Iran, particularly during the Obama administration's nuclear negotiations, and in 2021 published her book, The Heartbeat of Iran. Ruth Michaelson writes for The Guardian from Istanbul, prior to which she was based in Cairo. I spoke to Michaelson earlier this week and started by asking her why Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi hasn't been as vocal about the war as some of his counterparts in the region, despite a very solid base of support for Palestine among the Egyptian population as a whole.
I think that Sisi has this intense sense of the division between the domestic audience and an international audience. I think we should never forget that when we're talking about Egypt, we're talking about a paranoid security state. And the terms that Sisi has used since October 2023, when speaking publicly about Gaza, is that he tends to focus primarily on these fears that people from Gaza, Palestinians from Gaza, would flee and through some confluence of agreements or not, end up camped in the Sinai Peninsula. And Sisi, in very much the way that he tends to do, has framed this as a kind of security threat. And there is an element of this where, the Egyptian state is in some ways right to be concerned that were Palestinians forced to leave Gaza and to set up in camps in the desert, and even if international donors pledge money, we've seen how that's gone in Lebanon, in Jordan, and in Syria, right? It wouldn't be a short stay. They wouldn't be allowed to return necessarily, and so there is an element of concern that's justified there, but that doesn't always tend to be the way that he talks about it.
That is interesting. I mean, the language is very interesting. I think you're right, because you notice that while a lot of the world is talking about it in terms of moral language, he isn't. He talks about it as this small security threat that can be contained.
Well, I mean, it's a lead on from the fact that, Egypt has been fighting against ISIS, in the words of the Egyptian state, in northern Sinai for about a decade now. But what that's really meant on the ground has been an enormous Egyptian military presence and in many cases, quite brutal crackdown on the northern Sinai population, many of whom have been displaced from areas near the Gaza border and never allowed to return to their homes. And so Sisi has always talked about northern Sinai as this place that needs to be under the state's control. And we've also seen at the same time that the state has tried to benefit from that. There's a huge company, Yahala, which has, it's reasonable to say, quite deep ties to the Egyptian security state and to the Egyptian government, where Palestinians have been paying thousands of dollars. I mean, at the beginning of this year, $10,000 per person to be able to exit through the Rafah crossing and and into Egypt. So you could say, if Palestinians were such a terrible security threat and their entry was such a terrible security threat to Egypt, why is there a state-backed company that was making money out of all of this? But, we don't... Egypt doesn't exactly have a lot of parts of the security state that want to speak publicly or to talk about the rationale behind what they're doing. So instead, what we get is Sisi conjuring Palestinians as a security threat, and then more kind of quiet background, but in many ways no less important, cooperation between the Egyptian and the Israeli military, despite what we've seen recently in Rafah and the changes around the Philadelphia corridor, which is the strip of land that runs along southern Gaza.
Yeah, you bring up Rafah. I mean, this is the only crossing point between Egypt and Gaza. It's become a bit of a political football, as you're mentioning. The Israelis and the Egyptians were arguing last month about who actually has control of it. What is the reality on the ground?
I mean, the reality right now is that the Israelis have said that they have, in their terms, operational control over the Philadelphia corridor. So that is this small strip of land that encompasses the Rafah crossing that runs along the southern border of the Gaza Strip with Egypt. And the Egyptian military and parts of the Egyptian state have been making a lot of noise in recent months about fears that Israel would take the crossing. The Israelis claim that they had to do this because there were Hamas tunnels underneath there, and we've seen not a huge amount of evidence being presented of the mass of tunnels that the Israelis claim were there. And at the same time, despite the fact that Egyptian officials have, supposedly sounded the alarm about this for months and months, when it actually happened, we saw complete silence. And what we've seen instead is a crackdown on pro-Palestine protests, or a deep desire to control pro-Palestine protests at home in Egypt. And that even extends to the fact that there were even 2 Egyptian soldiers killed when there was some kind of confrontation between Israeli soldiers and Egyptian soldiers around Rafah a couple of weeks ago. And the Egyptian military didn't have a presence at their funerals, which, of course, that has a deep and profound symbolism and social impact, including for the people from these villages where these soldiers were being buried. Yeah. And that meant that those funerals, I wouldn't say they turned into out-and-out protests, but we certainly saw plenty of videos suggesting that people from these villages were very, very angry, and they certainly had something to say about the lack of state presence to honor these men that had been engaged in activity that is deeply and highly symbolic to the Egyptian state. Yeah,
it is very interesting when you see little fragments like that, because it really gives the impression that the differences between the reality of how Egyptians have welcomed the Palestinians who've made it there, tried to find them jobs and so on, and the way that the government is dealing with it. And as you say, the government is terrified of an escalation. But tell me about, we'll talk about Istanbul in a second, which is where you are. But why do you think, in broadly, the Egyptians haven't adopted the approach of the Turks when they offered asylum to millions of Syrian refugees fleeing the civil war?
I think that goes back to Sisi's paranoia about what that would mean. I think that he immediately thinks about tent camps along the border in the Sinai. But maybe a better comparison would be to look at how Sudanese refugees have been treated in Egypt, which is unfortunately unbelievably badly. And we've even heard of cases of Sudanese people trying to return to Sudan because the situation, their treatment in Egypt has been so bad. And why not offer asylum to millions of people to allow them to flee conflict? I mean, Sisi has said it's because they're afraid of that this would mean that these people would be permanently unable to return, and it would be a sort of Lebanon-like situation. And unfortunately, there might be some rationale to that the Israelis have an interest in ensuring that Palestinians would not be able to return. And I mean, this is an issue that is very sensitive, very important to a huge number of Egyptians. But the way that we've seen the state deploy resources in this area has been in controlling how people talk about it, because they're scared that if they give a little bit on this issue, then people will start asking for more. And Egypt is a state in economic crisis. That doesn't mean it can't accommodate more people. That economic crisis also is one that is spurred in very large part by government corruption. I think there's an idea that maybe if the state started to show some flexibility on this key issue, who knows what people could demand.
Yeah, and also who knows what the Israelis or the Americans might accept in the long run. So you just don't want to open that door. And I guess also they don't know how long this war will go on for. It might just go on and on and on.
Well, Benjamin Netanyahu has certainly made plenty of noise about the idea that the war could continue until 2025. There is every indication that the Israelis want this war to continue. And I think that there is some justified concern on the part of the Egyptians that accepting Palestinians would not be a short-term thing. Yeah. And they say that they don't want to, that, again, any money that might be promised to them from overseas, that tends to dry up unless Egypt does what they so often do and present the risk, or present an influx of migrants as a potential risk to the European Union. Yeah. And say, if you don't give us money to house people, then they're going to come to you. Yeah. Like that.
Well, let's talk about another big state that seems to use the same threat. Why do you think the Turks have spoken so differently about the Gaza war to the Egyptians?
I do think that part of this is that Erdogan often likes to present himself as a potential leader, at least, of the Muslim world, and that he's standing up for the interests of Muslims around the world, and that he has genuine concern. But at the same time, I think that he's wanted to show a lot of emotion through the way that he's spoken. He's come out with, remarks comparing Netanyahu to Hitler, in a way somewhat rubbing these kinds of things into the faces of European partners that Turkey has by saying, you can't control me, and I know how to kind of light the emotional touch paper. And he's followed up with cutting some trade ties. There were 54, I believe, types of goods that Turkey has now prevented the export to Israel, and they've stopped direct flights and things like this. Yeah. So there is a sense of he's made good on some elements of scaling back the trade relations that we've seen restored over the past decade since the Mavi Marmara. Yeah. But at the same time, the question always with Erdogan is how long these things will last. Erdogan is also someone that called Bashar al-Assad a war criminal, and then later on started talking, in recent years about how he wanted to sit with him. Yeah. I don't think he's necessarily going to turn around and say tomorrow that he wants to go and sit with Benjamin Netanyahu. Right. But Erdogan obviously sees more of a value, domestically at least, in using his platform to speak out in the way that he does, versus and in some ways kind of sacrificing Turkey's potential role as a mediator. That's the focus that he has. He's thinking about his reputation at home and among some elements of his base.
Do you think that the lack of a land border with Israel or Palestine makes it easier for him in a way? Because he's not worried about the same things that we were talking about the Egyptians are concerned about.
I do think that's part of it. Turkey has given some humanitarian visas to people from Gaza to come here and have medical treatment. But we're talking about numbers in a few thousand, not necessarily, there's 2 million people in Gaza, and a lot of them understandably would like to be able to flee. And so, yes, it is a completely different set of considerations that Erdogan would have. But he did, at one point, there was a rather interesting incident a few weeks ago where he said 10,000 Hamas fighters have been treated in Turkish hospitals, which obviously made everyone sit up and take notice, because how on earth have we missed 10,000 Hamas fighters? And then it turned out that a presidential aide sort of quietly said to Reuters, oh, he misspoke. He means 10,000 people from Gaza. But in Erdogan's terms, the 10,000 Hamas fighters line, even if it gets walked back later.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's served its purpose.
Yes, exactly. I mean, Erdogan knows how to go for the emotional, always, with the rhetoric that he has. And that's obviously what he's going for with this. And I mean, Turkish aid groups have sent, or when the Rafah crossing was open for aid, they previously were sending enormous amounts of aid that they were trucking in through Rafah. What this will mean over the long term is always the question with Erdogan, not what he says in the short term.
And actually, that's the part I wanted to get to with you. What do you think is the longer term game that the Turks want out of this? You saw the report straight after the October attacks that Turkey had closed the door to Hamas leaders. In the long run, what do you think Erdogan wants out of the war, even if the war continues?
Well, I mean, Turkey is always very concerned about what's happening in Jerusalem. That is something that always, the symbolism of Jerusalem and Turkish funding to preserve Muslim religious buildings and mosques and buildings of Ottoman historical significance in Jerusalem is something that is always bubbling away in the background with Turkey. It's not their primary interest, but it's something that the Turkish state has actually invested a lot of time and effort in over the years. Long term, I mean, I think that Turkey doesn't want a situation where Hamas leaders are forced to leave Qatar and they end up resident in Turkey, simply because I think there are Turkish diplomats and people in the foreign ministry who think that that would be an enormous headache. There are some members of Hamas that have Turkish passports, and the Turkish state seems pretty comfortable with them being able to travel in and out. But the idea that there would be a permanent base here for Hamas, I think, is something that Turkey might start to bristle at a little bit. But then the question is also who in the Turkish government would bristle at it, because this also has the ring of something where Erdogan, famously mercurial, might say one day, oh, this is a great idea, let's absolutely do it, while some aides in the background sort of think, is this going to be a problem for us in the long term? Which it could be. Yeah, which it could be, yeah.
Do you think that the relationship that the Egyptians and the Turks have in the region have been affected by the war? Or do you think that they are roughly in the place that they were before the war started?
Well, I mean, Egypt and Turkey have had a very changeable relationship recently. So Turkey went on a sort of broad sweep throughout the region, culminating in the presidential elections last year, which was basically the decision that we're going to be friends with everyone now and to reestablish diplomatic relations. And we saw this real warming of relations between Egypt and Turkey, where, Erdogan famously for years had a statue of the Rabah symbol of the hand on his desk and had welcomed many exiled members of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood to Turkey. And the Egyptians were very unhappy about the fact that they'd set up TV stations and they were broadcasting back home. And suddenly those TV stations vanished and those people got sent elsewhere to Europe when they started to reestablish these relations. But a fair comparison with Turkish-Israeli relations, at times anyway, is that trade relations during that period between Egypt and Turkey never stopped. There was a lot of political back and forth, there was a lot of sparring, but actually the trade never stopped. I think both countries feel that they're on the same side when it comes to thinking about the long-term consequences of what's happening in Gaza and how to handle it. And both of them are very concerned. And so if anything, this is bringing them closer together where things were already extremely warm. I mean, there was already, a meeting between Erdogan and Sisi last year before the 7th of October.
That was Ruth Michaelson in Istanbul. This long October war has disrupted the political relationships that were changing across the Middle East. To some degree, because the war has gone on for so long and caused such devastation, it has reset relationships or dragged them back years or even decades. I spoke to Chloe Cornish, the Financial Times' Gulf business correspondent in Dubai, we discussed the diplomatic crisis between Qatar and the other Gulf states that lasted for 4 years from 2017, and how that had been affected by the recent conflict. But I started by asking her about normalization between the Gulf states and Israel, and how that has been affected by what is happening on the ground in Gaza.
The UAE still sees the Abraham Accords as a strategic decision. They've been very clear they're not going to reverse it as a consequence of the war in Gaza. But in terms of the practical progress that can be made in building relations, commercial relations, investment relations between Israel and the UAE, that has obviously taken a hit because of the war in Gaza. It's very hard now for an Emirati business person to publicly be seen doing business with Israel. You do find Israeli entrepreneurs who will insist that things are going on as normal, but if you ask people on the Emirati side, they'll say, yeah, this is not the time to be seen to be doing business in Israel. It's just not a good look right now. And of course, it's important to remember that there's a big Palestinian and Lebanese and Egyptian population here in Dubai who run a lot of these family offices to practical intents and purposes, and they may not feel so comfortable pursuing those lines of business as well. So that's, I think, the main impact that the war has had in terms of the developing of the relationships between the two states.
Do you think that those kind of frozen relationships are likely to continue for a while, as long as the hot war continues, certainly?
I think you can't see the upside for an Emirati business person at the moment, at least, of being openly in talks for deals with Israel. But that could change, right? This is a very pragmatic and practical place. And, one of the sort of cliches, but the true cliches of the UAE is that there's no politics here, just business. And so things that have gone on the thaw could be reheated, but it all depends really on what kind of settlement and outcome there'll be from this war, I guess.
Yeah. Do you think the Accords can actually survive the war? There was a piece in Time magazine that argued that actually it might be time for the whole Accords to be scrapped, because instead of persuading Israel down a path to peace with the Palestinians, it seems like it was encouraging the Israeli leadership to just ignore the simmering conflict.
Well, then I guess the Israelis would argue that Hamas may have decided to start its offensive when it did because of the normalization process being underway with Saudi Arabia, right? So, I mean, all of these things. That was a theory, yeah. A lot of these things depend on who's making the argument. But no, certainly from the UAE side, the leadership here has been very clear that they see upside in greater connectivity around the region. The UAE doesn't generally, as a general rule, doesn't see the point of isolating neighbors. They've learned now from experience that it doesn't ultimately serve your commercial and strategic interests most of the time. So I don't think, no, certainly from the UAE's perspective, I don't think that this is dead. From the Saudi Arabia's perspective, now there's a lot more leverage that Saudi has in terms of pursuing normalization. That's maybe, there's obviously more movement there and it's very much more unfinished. That's probably the more interesting realm, I guess.
In terms of how Riyadh might try to look for a deal with the US that they would be happy accepting, even in the current political climate, that would lead to eventual normalization between them and the Israelis.
Yeah, I think some of the arguments that have been made around the UAE and Bahrain's normalization with Israel were that the Palestinians didn't get enough, right? That there wasn't much in there for them. Saudi now could take a different tack, and now the Gulf has really brought back the two-state solution with a vengeance. I mean, that wasn't on the table almost before. And now that is absolutely key to the negotiations and a red line as far as the Gulf is concerned, I think. So, you could see a very different deal coming out of that, couldn't you? But we'll have to see it.
It does feel like the mood has shifted, particularly on the two-state solution. That previously perhaps there was a tendency to say, well, let the simmering occupation continue, and you have a little bit here and a little bit there for the Palestinians, but nothing major and concrete and substantial. And I think it does feel as if the longer the war has gone on, it's just become kind of politically impossible to continue along that track. So it does feel like something has shifted in the mindset of the Arabs in the region.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's probably worth pointing out as well that the UAE, its main engagement on this war has actually been humanitarian. I mean, they've put a lot of effort into aid for Gaza. They've also been politically somewhat sidelined. So having made that accord when they did, in a way, I think the UAE was less able to deal with the Palestinian side. And so they're not so influential in terms of the negotiations and the mediations that are happening, with the involvement of Qatar and Egypt and the rest. I mean, in the UAE's main card it's been playing has been to supply humanitarian aid. I mean, way before the US built that pier, the UAE was bringing in aid by sea. So that doesn't necessarily give you a great deal of influence on the ground, but it's certainly an important part of the UAE's policy here. It's certainly what the UAE wants to talk about anyway.
Yeah, that is interesting because, I mean, the UAE historically always likes to have a foot in both camps. But you're right, now that because of the normalization and because, of course, Hamas have a political office in Qatar, it becomes much harder for them to be involved in the politics of it. And kind of the leadership of the mediation has passed to, of course, Egypt, but also to Qatar, which has much more influence on the ground now.
Yeah, absolutely. And the UAE does have big concerns about the outcomes of this conflict. They're worried, as the UAE always is, about things that can stoke Islamist extremism in other parts of the region or other parts of the world. And that is certainly a fear that the renewal of the Palestinian cause might contribute to rising extremism in other places. So it's not like the UAE doesn't feel it has any skin in the game here, but that there is...
Right.
That there are definitely concerns, but it's not got a leading role within the sort of negotiations and mediations. Although they are expected to take a leading role in financing the rebuilding of Gaza, hopefully when that happens.
Interestingly, you said earlier about the UAE and perhaps other countries feeling that they've understood now that alienating neighbors is not going to work. I imagine you were referring to the blockade of Qatar. Do you think that the Gaza war has changed the way that the Gulf states relate to each other? You'll have seen that, and I don't just mean the Gulf states like intra-Arab. You'll have seen that the Saudis invited Iran to the GCC meeting in January. The idea being that they seem like they want to pull their neighbors more tightly together at this moment.
So the de-escalation policy with Iran has been in place now for quite a while. The Houthi attacks on Abu Dhabi a few years ago was obviously a really big wake-up call. Not only that there was no Pax Americana, or there was no American security guarantee really in the region, but that the UAE and Saudi were going to have to deal with Iran, which they'd always known that they were going to have to, but that was a real kind of flashpoint. And certainly I hear in the UAE, at least, credit being given to Iran for having not totally acted through its proxies during this conflict. So after the Israeli bombing of the embassy in Damascus and their retaliation, the Gulf, you maybe noticed at the time that there was no Gulf state that condemned that retaliation. They all saw that as being completely within Iran's right to do it. And here you hear policy people saying that actually it was a very well-calibrated response. And they are happy to see Iran acting through state institutions rather than proxies, because that's what they want, is they want less proxy war stuff that's completely messy and chaotic, and more state-to-state interaction. And so they are happy when they see that from Iran. I guess they'll be watching very closely now, obviously after Raisi was killed, to see what shape things are taking in Tehran. I mean, I know that the policy people are watching that very closely. Certainly in Dubai, a lot of attention is paid to Iran as a very important trade partner. There are loads and loads of Iranians here and always have been. So big picture, Iran has always been important within the Gulf. This war doesn't necessarily change that, but it does. There has been credit given, I think, to Iran for acting as a state rather than through its proxies during parts of this war.
That was Chloe Cornish in Dubai. Across the Persian Gulf from that city sits Iran, and no country has been so closely watched for its response to the Gaza war. It's no exaggeration to say that Iran, through its relationship with Hezbollah, the Houthis, and other groups across the region, has had the ability to keep this war contained or broaden it significantly. So far, they've chosen the former. Tara Kangarlou is an independent journalist who has reported extensively from Iran, and I spoke to her from London, where I started by asking her whether she felt there was any appetite in Iran for a wider conflict.
Right now, probably not. And the reason I say that is for a host of reasons, because Iran domestically is facing an array of challenges, mainly financial. The Iranian population is disillusioned toward its government. You have 40% of university graduates are unemployed. There's mass migration. Inflation fluctuates at around 40%. Poverty is looming. 1/3 of a nation lives in poverty. And I say that because it's important to understand that the majority of the 89 million Iranian people don't want conflict with the region, and they don't also agree.
Right.
They don't also agree with the destructive policies and behaviors of its regime, right? And the second thing is, we
Yeah.
always have to ask, what is to the benefit of the Islamic regime? A wider conflict. How would that benefit the longevity of the Islamic regime, of a regime that knows that the people inside the country are resentful toward it, right? So Iran has, over the years, pursued this shadow war with Israel, right? A tit for tat. They strike somewhere, they strike back, and that somewhere is usually Syria, Iraq, and southern Lebanon. As you know, Iran has many proxies that in one shape or form fight its fight against Israel. And the second bit is, Iran understands that if it goes into a full-scale war, military conflict with Israel, its biggest ally, being the United States, will come in, will support. And Iran very well knows that it cannot win that war, and it is not to the Islamic regime's interest to pursue that. And also, Iran, since the 1979 revolution, has pursued this destructive behavior in the region. Its mission was to establish itself as this, Islamic authority in the Middle East. But again, how? By its destructive behavior. So a wider conflict is really not, I don't think, at this point beneficial for the Islamic regime's longevity and interests. But these small scale engagements, yes.
Yeah, but it feels like the regime in Tehran understands that. Our previous guest, Chloe Cornish, described from Dubai the sense that regional powers are relatively relieved at how Iran has acted during the war, and that the huge Iranian counterstrike on Israel following the bombing of the Iranian embassy in Damascus was actually rather well calibrated. So it feels like Tehran understands that it isn't in its interest to get involved in this war.
100%. I mean, what would they gain out of it, right? Iran wants to have power in the region, right? And it certainly does through its proxies, through the many groups, the militia that it supports, whether it's Kataib Hezbollah in Iraq, the Hezbollah of Lebanon. That, by the way, Faisal, you have to understand that Iran, being a Shia Muslim country, and the Shia, the support of the Shia clergy, does not share the same ideology, right, with, let's say, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hamas. And that's a nuance that I think is worth noting, okay? Ideologically, Iran has maybe one or two proxies, okay, that it really aligns with. But elsewhere, whether it be Syria or with regards to Hamas, that's not the case. So Iran has maintained its strength through these proxies. But absolutely, it can't fight a full-fledged war with Israel and the United States equally.
And the
Yeah,
United
and you
States,
know
yeah,
the
yeah.
attacks that you mentioned, which were the response to the Israeli strikes on the Iran consulate in Damascus. As you said, it was very calculated. But again, I always ask myself when I look at that attack, hundreds of missiles. Wouldn't we wonder if one of them would go south? Wouldn't we wonder if one of them would attack, something
Yeah.
that would lead to more destruction and an escalation? And I think that's careless. And Faisal, if I may say, that particular scenario in April reminded me of the attacks that we saw in January 2020 in the aftermath of the Qasem Soleimani assassination. Let's remember that. Okay, the Trump administration kills this, big IRGC commander, powerful figure, right? Some level
Yeah.
of popularity among the Islamic regime loyalists in Iran. And then Iran retaliates, and suddenly, in Iraq, right, near the US bases, no one gets killed, no one gets hurt. So this idea that these attacks are coordinated is something that has been proven, right? And that was, by the way, reported. Okay, there was this coordination,
Yeah.
and then in this
Yeah.
case, it was
Well,
also
I mean,
coordinated.
at least they're telegraphed.
Yes, yes, exactly. So, it's a tit for tat. Israel and Iran's conflict, unfortunately, at the cost of, the lives and livelihood and dreams and aspirations of people in both countries and the region at large, is continuing to be seen.
One of the major events that Iran has had to deal with just in the recent months, of course, is the death of Ibrahim Raisi. Do you think that now, in particular, as they kind of search for a replacement, that there's just so much going on domestically in Iran that, in a sense, it doesn't really have the political bandwidth to worry about what's happening abroad?
It's interesting because the way I look at it is the Islamic regime and its leaders were never worried about the interests of the people, right? The Iranian people. I gave you some numbers and stats on, the challenges that the economy is facing and employment and poverty and so on. And the reason for that is Iran is an incredibly rich country. Its economy is not just an oil and gas economy; it's a diversified economy. But that never benefited the people of Iran, right? And the regime has always
Mm.
focused externally. Okay, how can we better equip ourselves to be more forceful regionally and never focus domestically? And so, coming back to Ibrahim Raisi, they are going to replace the president. When I say they, the establishment, the supreme leader and his allies, they're going to put a new person in
Yeah.
charge in a sham
Yeah.
election. And I'm not just saying that because I don't agree with the behavior of the regime, but because that is the case, Faisal. They pick a few candidates, they vet them, they allow them to play in this election game, and then someone gets elected. And that person will follow the pursuits, these destructive pursuits of the establishment of the regime that again ultimately is not going to benefit the people of Iran. And mind you, Iran's oil exports hit a 6-year high as the West continued to impose sanctions. And that begs the question, this is a country that for the last many years has been under sanctions. But how is it that they're having such high export, right? How is it that their influence continues to be robust in the region? And that tells us something
Mm.
that the Islamic regime's calculus is strong, is smart, and one that is to really not the benefit of the people and also the stability in the region.
Well, what do you think the questions will be in the forthcoming presidential election? Because sometimes, it's an opportunity for certain trends within the political establishment to be aired.
Mm.
People think about it: is it going to be a more liberal person? Is it going to be somebody very close to Khamenei? What is it going to be? And maybe the Gaza war is going to be part of that conversation.
You will never find any candidate who will not support the Islamic regime's narrative toward Palestine, right? The Palestinian cause. And more so, I want to frame it as more anti Israel. All candidates and any leader in Iran will always pursue the same line, okay, toward its support for Palestine and anti Israel sentiments. Two events happened that truly humiliated the Iranian people. One was the downing of the Ukrainian jet, okay? And the other one was the Women Life Freedom movement that was heavily cracked down by the regime in the aftermath of Mahsa Amini's death. Okay, so the Iranian people have no interest to participate in an election that they believe is not going to, bear any fruit that would benefit them. But when it comes to Gaza and Iran's support for Hamas, that has been ongoing for many years, is not going to change.
That was Tara Kangarlou in London. This has been The Lead from New Lines Magazine. You can find Ruth Michaelson on Twitter at MSR Michaelson. Chloe Cornish, the FT's correspondent, can be found at Chloe N. Cornish. And Tara Kangarlou on Twitter is Tara Kangarlou. If you want to hear more about the Gaza war from inside Israel, from inside Gaza, or from Lebanon, do check out our recent episodes of The Lead linked in the show notes. You can also find extensive reporting and long-form essays on our website. This week's episode was produced by Finbar Anderson and hosted by me, Faisal Al Yafai. For more like this, subscribe to The Lead on your favourite podcast app or visit our website, newlinesmag.com. If you enjoyed this week's episode, please rate us and leave a review. It really does help us to grow our audience. Thank you for joining us, and we'll see you again soon.